Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Jonathan and Annlyn Kulp. They were recommended to me by Rebecca Mui, who said that they might be able to give me some unique insight into the topic of propaganda as it pertains to race, in part because Jonathan and Annlyn are an interracial couple. That's a particularly interesting situation for our discussion because, as we talked about with propaganda a lot, polarization is something which is extremely common in regard to being propagandized, right? You've got one group that thinks extremely in this direction and another group that thinks extremely in the other direction. So when you get Jonathan, who is raised in a similar environment to me, in a conservative, Christian, largely white, rural community, and then you get Annlyn, who is raised in a very different community, you kind of see these two worlds collide, and you see what comes out on top as they've worked through issues together. And so it's a beautiful depiction of two people who are trying to uncover truth and work together through the polarization, the political polarization, the racial polarization, and everything. I think in the interview, throughout the whole thing, I think my favorite part, and the part that I think you ought to look out for the most, is the one where Jonathan and Annlyn come up with their two big reasons why things are the way that they are in the world, in the United States, but especially in the church. Like, why do people, why are we susceptible to this racism, this propaganda? And so they came up with two ideas that I completely agree with. The first one is politicizing, right? And that's something that Jacques Ellul talked about, and I had a quote in our Foundations episode, and I'll make sure to put that in the show notes here too. But Ellul talked about how politics it ends up making everything political and polarizing to the extreme. And that's so true. Everything is a political issue. Even wearing a mask has become a political issue, or was, at least when COVID was around. The other thing that was mentioned was this idea of innocence, being in a guilt-innocence culture. And I don't usually hear us talk about our own culture as guilt-innocence. Usually when I talk to people who go cross-culturally, they talk about how weird it is to be in an honor-shame culture, right? Because it's so different from ours. But it makes sense that, well, if honor-shame is different than ours, then we must have our own thing, right? And that's just something that we're swimming in, so we don't really ever take note of it. But we are in a guilt-innocence culture. And so this idea that we don't want to be viewed as guilty is a big deal. And it's in part why we can't really talk about race, because I can't really admit that I'm guilty of things that would constitute as racism, because you're either guilty or you're not, right? There aren't really levels, degrees, any of those sorts of things. And I can't lump myself into the category of having racist thoughts or racist actions or anything like that. There's a lot more than that from Jonathan and Annlyn in this episode, so hopefully you're able to listen to the whole thing and enjoy their wisdom and insight. So the reason that I asked you all to share, I think it was Rebecca who actually recommended chatting with you, because I was telling her a little bit about this season that I'm doing on propaganda and truth and discipleship, and just trying to figure out how do we uncover propaganda in our own lives and things that we've bought into, because it's so hard to see. And then how do we help other people, disciple other people to see that? And then especially as the church, like, how do we do this as the church? Because it's so much more important for our witness to be able to do this effectively. And so Rebecca mentioned you guys and said that you might have some insight. And I think because of your relationship, you probably have a lot of insight that you guys have been able to glean off of each other and be a bit more introspective. So hopefully you can share a little bit of that wisdom with me today. All right. So maybe first of all, if you guys want to introduce yourselves and maybe give a little bit of background that you might think would be pertinent here.
Mm-hmm.
You go ahead.
Okay. My name is Annlyn Kulp. I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. My parents were both born and raised in Haiti, and they met here in the States. So I guess I call myself Haitian American. I was in Brooklyn till I was about 14. Then I moved to Long Island, so kind of urban to suburban type living. And I went to school and everything here in New York. I went to college at Stony Brook University. I did a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in social work. I'm currently home taking care of our 4 girls, 11, 9, 7, and 5, and partnering with John in ministry here at our small church.
And you said Haitian background?
Yes.
Okay, that's fascinating. I've been reading a lot about Haiti recently because I've been trying to narrow down what do I want to talk about when we get to our government section. And I think Haiti, I went and saw the Black Panther movie. I don't know if you've seen the recent one. And
saw me, I need to.
Yeah, well, at the end, when they named the guy, they named the kid, I'm gonna butcher the name, but like Toussaint, I think they named him. I was like, oh my gosh, I know who that is, and it was very anti-imperial, and it was interesting. So I'm enjoying studying Haiti.
Yeah, lots of history there.
Yeah, so I'm John Kulp, obviously. So I grew up on a farm in Middle America, the state of Wisconsin, and grew up as a pastor's kid and a country boy. Although I got coined as a city slicker by my family because I preferred to be in town at my dad's car retail shop rather than being on the farm, and I didn't like to get dirty. So needless to say, I've been living in New York City for 18 years, and this is where I call home, and I tell people this is where I finished growing up. So, met Annlyn well before I actually moved to New York. And then we became more acquainted and realized that we had mutual interest in each other at some point, and were married in 2007. Always had an interest in kind of reaching the young, kind of older boy, young man population to help them find manhood and ultimately find Jesus. I have a particular vision to see young men that would otherwise maybe be on the streets to be under the lordship of Jesus and to use their gifts and call in the body of Christ. So I think Annlyn and I particularly cared about young people, and so that also drew us together. So somewhere along the way, in 2011, I was called to be a part of the pastoral team at our church here in Brooklyn, Followers of Jesus Mennonite Church. And in 2017, I was commissioned to the lead role, and so that takes a lot of my time and energy, of course. And we're both still trying to learn how to be parents.
All right, thank you. So as I was trying to figure out some of the questions to ask you, I was looking through different materials on YouTube and looking at some of your other interviews. And one of the ones that I came across was Anabaptist perspective interview. And in there, I was on the edge of my seat because you guys were talking about your first fight as a couple. And but then I was kind of left hanging because you never really dug into what that was. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think that it's going to be pertinent to kind of what we're talking about today, if it's not too personal, would you mind sharing a little bit about your first fight as a couple, and maybe how that came about and what you learned from that?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll set the stage.
Yeah.
You give the content, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But so setting the stage, Annlyn was still wrapping up senior year of undergraduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on campus to see her, and we were feeling pretty good about our dating relationship. And then somewhere along the line, well, I think she was taking some Black history classes and kind of talking about that, and I was interested. And somewhere along the line, I, chimed in with Abraham Lincoln, and like what a great guy he was, right? Black community. And Annlyn didn't seem to be quite as intrigued as I was. So you take it from here.
I think, this is 17, 18 years ago. So I just have a recollection that at the moment, I was understanding him to say that we should all be grateful for what Lincoln did, that kind of thing. And I'm like, I think my reaction was, I'm grateful for the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was the right thing to do. But furthermore, he didn't do it because he just felt that it needed to be abolished. Like, you'll learn in African American history courses that he wasn't an abolitionist. He cared about the Union. And so if he could have kept slavery and kept the Union, we might not have had the emancipation. But because it was going to keep the Union, it was all about the Union. The priority wasn't about freeing the slaves. And so I'm like, yeah, that was a good thing that he did, but he should have done that a long time ago. And he didn't do it because he had he felt personally interested in caring for African Americans. And then furthermore, there was personal things that he said about feeling that white people were superior to Black people at the time, which would have been the popular thought, but that just kind of adds to the idea that he's not exactly like the Black hero for us.
Yeah, so of course that was very hard for me to hear, that she would push back and kind of say, oh, he might not have done that. And I said, well, how can this person of color actually not value what Abraham Lincoln did in freeing the slaves? I mean, this is a historic time in American history. And for me, it's like really important, because I'm not interested in being a part of a country that has a history of slavery. And so the hero that saves the day, like, that's going to be forever celebrated. But I think to understand the collision, I was exposed to more of a nationalistic driven American history, and Annlyn had been exposed to a more comprehensive American history that kind of had a lot broader perspective.
So for you, was that like homeschool, Christian school, or just what you learned from maybe your family and peers?
So I think it's kind of twofold. I think it's the actual history that I learned, that I was taught, and that was primarily the BECA curriculum. And so I fell in love with American history right out of the gate, right? First grade. And I was well on my way to being nationalistically minded myself. That's kind of another story. But at this point, I was not compelled that way. But that was the framework. I'd said it was kind of twofold. I think the second piece is just growing up in Middle America, right? You just don't have a broader perspective.
Oh yeah, no, I 100% with you on that. I grew up on that same and similar curriculum, and I think a very similar background in rural Pennsylvania. So,
right. Yep.
So, yeah, as an interracial couple, I think that you guys have, with your two different backgrounds, like I said earlier, I think that because you've gotten to see kind of both groups and then come together, and meet, you kind of figure out where some of those different ideas clash. And John, in the interview that I watched, you made a comment that I thought was really pertinent to our justice discussions today. You said that we're foolish to think that groups which have experienced significant oppression were formed over generations, but that the oppressive group wasn't also formed over generations. And in my mind, there's this clip. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but Oprah, like back in her very early days, she went to, I think it was Forsyth, Georgia, and she's there and she's talking to this group of people because in Forsyth, Georgia, like they had kicked out every Black person. They said like they had sunset laws or some whatever they called them, where if any Black person was there after sunset, like there's no guarantee what was going to happen. And so they literally just took people's property and kicked them out. And so when she's there, you see these people who are rioting. You've got like 10 kids that are 10-year-old kids who are like, you can see the vitriol in their faces, this hatred. And I'm thinking, I'm like, well, wait a second. I was alive at that time. Like those 10-year-old kids are only a couple years older than me. Like they're the ones going into Congress and the Senate and all of that stuff right now, like becoming mayors and all that stuff. Like for me to think that, that's all history, ancient history. It's like, no, it's in people my age today. Like I can see them on video camera doing this stuff, having this stuff indoctrinated into them. And so that was really eye-opening to me, to kind of think about that kind of thing. Because I don't think of my group as being indoctrinated or racist. So maybe each of you, I know, John, you just kind of shared a little bit of your views of Abraham Lincoln. But I don't know if Annlyn, there's anything that you've uncovered as well, maybe about some of your thoughts where you realize that, oh, I was maybe mistaken on this. So maybe you guys could give a few ideas or actions that you've uncovered in your own life through your relationship with each other that helps you to realize some things that maybe you were taught or understood incorrectly growing up.
Yeah, I actually watched that clip then recently about Oprah in Forsyth, Georgia. And hearing the comments just kind of reminded me of what I thought racism was growing up. So to me, the issue was the people that were in the interview, the people that were just using the N-word on national TV, saying we don't want them here and they need to stay with their people and that type of stuff. To me, I understood that was the issue, the big issue that we need to battle in terms of racism. Just blatant racist, just people walking around doing and saying intentionally hurtful things with no qualms about it. But I have learned, just even it was because of our relationship and just in my relationships with people at church and things too, that it's not so much the blatant racism that is hard to battle. That's obvious. It's right in your face. It's the subtle underlying subconscious prejudices that we don't realize is ingrained in our society and therefore ingrained in the way we relate to each other. That's the bigger battle. How do you bring that to a conscious awareness so that people can interact with each other in healthier ways consciously? And so how that happened for us is like, this happened a while ago. I'll just share a personal story, but we were on a date. I think we were married by now. It was in our early years, but we were in a mall. We're sitting where we could eat, and where you were eating, you could see things happening. So somebody got arrested. So it was a night where I guess several people decided to shoplift, but the first person that was being escorted out by police was a person of color. I don't know if they were Latino or Black, but brown, right? And John's initial comment was, got him, which, I agreed. I was like, I don't know what these kids are up to. They were young kids. And then later on, as we're sitting on our date, I think it was an Asian lady that was being escorted out. And John said, you got to wonder how she got herself in that position. And all of a sudden I was like, why didn't she say that before? Well, and so that was like really good for both of us because I mean, obviously John's not racist, right? Like I know he loves me. I know he loves like not just me, but all people of color. Like he's not, he would never intentionally hurt anyone with his words. And he truly loves and cares about people. But there was this underlying assumption that for some people, they got what they deserve. And for someone else, maybe they just got themselves in a bad situation. But like, then we ended up having a really good discussion about it because he wasn't consciously aware that he was even doing that, but I could hear it right away. So that's an example.
Yeah, there's a lot, that we can kind of unpack here. One thing I might note, kind of referencing the Forsyth, Georgia scenario there with Oprah. So there's something very specific to the South. And so I think, going back to the comment that you referenced that I had made, I think there are families, right? And to your observation, these 10-year-olds that are now, in their 40s or 50s or whatever, that they're potentially a product of a family line that have held racist views for generations, right? And maybe even go back to being slave owners. And so there's a really a very specific thing there that they have to deal with, and it impacts just as deeply, I think, as those that are oppressed. I think that what happens maybe in the North, where you didn't have quite that overt of racism, slavery, and so forth, you have a problem where, because you didn't have to engage these racial issues, then you don't actually know for sure what you think or feel until you have to encounter it. And so, and then when you do, and things begin to be exposed, and you say things that like, whoa, that didn't sound right. I didn't mean that. Yeah, I definitely didn't mean that. Let me think. How should I say that? Well, actually, you kind of didn't mean it, but you didn't know that. And so that's kind of, I think, the challenge that many Americans in the white community have to grapple with. The challenge is that takes humility. And if we're not willing to have those conversations and look at that, then you can allow that to entrench in your heart, and that can become something that you pass on.
Yeah, there's definitely, growing up in the North, there's a lot now that after doing a lot of studying that I'm like, oh yeah, I can look back on my life or some of the things that different family members or friends said and realize now, okay, yeah, I really was steeped in it, but you don't realize it while you're in it. And now that I feel like I've stepped out of it, it's very difficult to see so many of my friends and family and church community who are just vitriolic against, this idea of systemic racism and that kind of stuff. It's hard when you're steeped in it. So one of the other things that you brought up in the interview, you'd mentioned Ukraine, and you'd mentioned some of the racism that was going on there. And, I think at this point in the United States, I think we've gotten a little bit better at talking about overt racism and denouncing overt racism. And what you brought up going on in Ukraine seems like one of those examples of overt racism that we should be able to denounce. Yet, like I'm living in Romania right now, bordering Ukraine. I don't watch U.S. news too much, but from my understanding, what was going on there in Ukraine didn't show up too much in U.S. news. So would you mind kind of talking a little bit about what was going on in Ukraine in regard to racism, and how much that was discussed in your circles or in the U.S.?
Yeah. So soon after the war broke out, everyone was fleeing the country, of course. And there are a lot of African students there, international students. They make up about 20% of the international student population in Ukraine, students from Africa, different parts of Africa. So they were fleeing too, trying to get on trains, some of them walking really far to get to the closest border they could get to. And when they would arrive either at a train or at a border, they were being turned away because they were African. They were told things like, you're not Ukrainian, so you can't seek asylum. Or getting on the train, they were told, Ukrainians get on first, you guys need to wait. And sometimes even trains that still had space, they were told they couldn't get on to those trains. And then when they did arrive to some countries, they were told, you can't seek asylum here, you need to go back to your country. This is for Ukrainians, not for Africans. And so there were people who found out about it in different countries and ended up, they started an everything's African student coalition, a global coalition of Africans, to help get those students out of the country and to help raise money for some of them to get out of then the bordering countries, or as countries that were providing asylum for Ukrainians, but not for them. So yeah, I noticed it, of course. I think I even looked it up to begin with. I wondered, what are the Black people doing over there? I usually wonder that when there's a situation like that. And then I found articles, but I had to look it up. It wasn't being reported. And then in my circle of friends, all my friends of color were sending messages to each other about it. It was posted on their stories and things like that. To be honest, we didn't discuss. We discussed it. We didn't really discuss it unless other people brought it up, especially in maybe more our circle of friends, where we're like, we're not sure if they're gonna think we're just trying to make trouble, so we're just not gonna make a big deal about it. So we were like, we'll bring it up if it seems convenient to come, like a convenient time to bring it up and then kind of talk about it. But we didn't want to trouble the waters at the time. So we just spoke about it with people that were aware and maybe wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I was just curious about that. I wasn't sure kind of where you'd go with that, but with John, with you bringing up being kind of steeped in nationalism and such growing up, one of the things that I've seen a whole lot in regard to how nationalism plays out is, if you're an ally with somebody, you can't really bring up the bad stuff. The same thing with the United States. Like, we can't bring up the bad things that we've done because we're a benevolent nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't know if you had any pushback in any of those discussions, but I guess you avoided having those discussions with people that you thought it might not go over well with.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, we were even processing. I'm not sure why we did. It's not something that we always do. Like, we're not afraid to have the hard conversations. I think it was following so many intense discussions already that we were like, you know what, let's just sit this one out.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah.
I think the takeaway, though, is that the conversation or the awareness didn't circulate in among the white community,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly did within the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think that in itself maybe is a little bit telling, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that I think, let me just say it this way. I think that the world, there's many people in the world that look on the situation in Ukraine and have sympathy for what they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe including Africa,
Mm-hmm.
but and certainly I think European background countries feel a real sense of alliance with Ukraine, but it's not so natural to kind of notice when there's a subgroup that is also suffering, because I guess it doesn't affect us, right? So
I don't know if you saw the coverage that Trevor Noah did on how the news even covered the war in Ukraine. There's where he plays all the clips that the news media is saying, this is happening in a developed nation and this is happening to Europeans. It's like almost like this shouldn't happen in these countries. I think even one clip said, this is not some third world country. This is Ukraine. Like, oh, it's okay if it happens in third world countries though. Like that type of subconscious, like, and I'm sure if that news anchor would be made aware, like, do you know what that statement sounds like? They might think about it, but that's where I notice it's the subconscious or not blatantly racist things that is actually are more pervasive and more hurtful.
Yeah, that's actually where I get my news over here, my U.S. news, as like Trevor Noah, John Oliver, and I don't know. It seems slightly less depressing to get it in comedic form. So speaking of that, of just this idea of how we're kind of oblivious to it, like it's in our subconscious and it comes out. What, like, specifically in regard to the church, because that's really, I feel the need to judge those inside the church, not those outside the church. Like, I expect the world to be the world, but it's really depressing when I feel like the church isn't being the church. What, where are maybe the biggest blind spots that you see the church, the modern church in the United States as having, and why? I know that it's partly conjectural and really complex, but if you could summarize it at all, what are the blind spots and why do we have them? What's keeping us from seeing?
Well, I think I know it sounds so simple, but it's just the easiest way for me to explain what I've observed, even just on my, like what I see on my social media, is that we've forgotten the basics of a two kingdom theology. And to me, that's such a important foundation. Like if as believers, we're all part of the kingdom of God and serving God and doing what he's calling us to do, then when things come up in the world, we're going to deal with it the way Jesus did. And so even if I don't understand what it's like to be a person of color, or even if I am confused about what is being said on both sides, if I apply the principle of treating someone the way I want to be treated, of submitting and laying my life down, all those basic, then I won't get wrapped up in but who did you vote for? But what party says that? And I've just observed that people are more concerned about political parties and the Constitution than about souls. And I feel that if you're concerned about souls, if you're maintaining a two kingdom theology, some of these things resolve themselves, and that people experience your love. People can feel heard, even if they're not completely understood. That it seems really basic, but it's missing for me. One way I explain it to people in a very simple way is that people in the circles that we're in, I'm usually a minority, right? We're more in conservative Anabaptist circles. And I've had some friends and family, they want to send me information about Candace Owens, but they never thought to ask me about how I feel personally. Like, and I don't really watch her stuff. I'm not a political person at all. I'm not wrapped up in any party, but I find it interesting that if I say anything about my experience, I'm immediately put into a certain camp. And I'm like, well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm actually just sharing my personal experience, but they can't hear past the political lines. And so I think that's just a perfect example of how we failed as a church. Like, if we're hearing what people share personally through political lines, so how can we be a light to the rest of the world?
Yeah, and sorry, yeah, in 2020, we had the pandemic, and then we had lots of opinions about how you respond to that. This whole thing of mask wearing, and then you had the situation in Minneapolis with Floyd's death, and then just other kind of police violence situations, and that year, one of the things that became clearer for me, well, one thing that happened is I fell even more in love with the gospel. And it became even more meaningful to me. And I thought it already was very much so. But one of the things that stood out to me is I realized that I think the reason the church is a bit handicapped on some of these things is because, boy, I didn't pre-formulate this. Let me work through this. So let me put it simply: the gospel is not our answer. And let me explain that. So when I talk about a situation where there was police violence, and I make the comment that this didn't need to happen. This shouldn't have happened. We should not continue to see Black men die at the hand of a policeman. And then the response is, well, if they would just stop resisting the law, if they would live above the law, these things could be avoided. The problem is, they're resisting arrest. And then you start to break that down, right? And you push back on these situations. And you say, well, but why is it that, that policemen seem to be confronting these situations more than they're confronting an equal situation with another person from a different race or a white person? And you start having these conversations, you start realizing that when you start pushing back, people start feeling like maybe you're trying to tell them that they're racist. Well, I never was trying to say that, but you get the feeling that they're starting to feel that. So they got to defend their position and their views. And so, or if Annlyn would start talking about her experience as a Black person, and they say, well, I never knew that. And oh my, have I ever made you feel that way? Well, it's okay that they're concerned about that. But what I find is that, well, what if you did make her feel a certain way? What are we going to do about it? Is it the end of the world? Is your life ending? Or is there healing? Is there forgiveness? Is there a way to walk through this? And so I'm kind of taking a long roundabout way here to say that I realize that within the white community, we very quickly want to say, I'm not racist, maybe even to the extent of saying racist doesn't exist anymore. And these problems are manufactured. They're just creating news content, whatever the arguments may be. And I'm saying, I think that you are trying to ensure a position where you're not guilty. We live our culture is primarily a guilt innocence culture. So as long as we can maintain innocence, we've obtained the ultimate, right? Some cultures would be driven more by the shame guilt or the shame honor of society. And so if I can maintain innocence, I've achieved the highest moral. So we're doing everything we can to protect our innocence. And so God forbid that I'm guilty in any way. And I'm saying, well, what if you just what if you actually discover you are guilty? The gospel is there for that. Like, that's where we find, can we go to Jesus and say, you know what, I think I have maybe a little bit of bias or racism, or maybe I was unkind, or maybe I didn't have a heart to treat my enemy the way Jesus did. I think for me, it comes back to the gospel, and really embracing that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Both of those things. I mean, the politicization, that's something that actually turned me to nonviolence. I would have never gone there if it wasn't for the polarization of 2016 and that just helping me to see my community for what it really was, and sending me down a really long rabbit trail of studies. But so yeah, I completely agree with that. But then also what you said about the trying to protect our perceived innocence, at least, it just reminds me about so much the other things that I've been looking at the moment, like the sexual abuse in the church. You look at Ravi Zacharias, or you look at the Southern Baptist Convention right now, and it's like they're trying to silence things. They're trying to silence things in the name of Christ. Well, we don't want to tarnish his reputation. Like, we want the church to look pure, the church to look innocent. So in the name of goodness and righteousness, we cover up sin to appear innocent. So yeah, I think those are two great answers to that question. So
really short. Like a summary. I think the willingness to be informed by our political preferences, rather than our personal relationships in the church, is a big issue.
Yeah, and in regard to personal relationships, I know for me personally, it really wasn't until I started to get to know more people of color and various backgrounds that I started to see things. Like when I started reading Black authors and historical works and things like that, I was like, oh, these aren't just issues that have popped up in 2016. Du Bois was talking about like some of the very same things that people are talking about today. And it's just, yeah, absolutely amazing. The thing that was the strongest for me was I have not talked to a Black person yet in the last 4 or 5 years since I started asking this question, who has not had a negative encounter with the police. That just blows my mind. My parents' neighbor is actually, he was a police officer and for many, many years. And I asked him, he's a black man. And I said, so wait, you're a police officer and you're a Black man. Like, so can you tell me, like, have you ever had any negative encounters with the police? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, a lot. And I was like, for like silly things, not just like speeding tickets. He's like, yeah, they pull me over for like, a light being out or not using a signal when I did, or some other things. And he's like, he's like, yeah, it's all over the place. And that was amazing for me to hear that coming from a Black man who is also a police officer, because he's walking in both of those worlds, and he's able to kind of see that. So maybe to end, final question. it's really easy, I think, for me at least, to get into these topics and become really depressed because it just seems like it's hopeless. Do you have any words of hope for specifically the church, in regard to maybe some things that we are doing well, or maybe some resources that we have at our fingertips that if we just access, like, we could turn things around? The gospel, I know that's one.
Yes, the gospel is definitely first and foremost. I think that what the things that I've experienced that have gone well in the last few years is even when we do mess up, because we will and we're human, is having people come back and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And I still don't know, but I care. I've had people message me that I hadn't spoken to in years, sending me messages like that. And that really touched me. I think that's something I've heard from other people too, other people of color who've said, like, just a random person reached out to me and said, I just want to say I'm sorry. And I think that's something that the church has done well at, like the humility to go back and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, and I could have done better, or I still don't know, but I want to do better, that type of thing. And just like kind of that's specifically on racial issues, but I think politically, I've been seeing more and more believers say, call each other out. Let's keep the first things first. Like, don't be afraid to call that out in each other and say, don't get wrapped up in that. There's other ways that we can care for people. Roe v. Wade is a very controversial thing going on right now. We could get wrapped up in the politics, or we could say, where's the closest single mom that I can help? Where's the closest Planned Parenthood that I can pray outside of? Like, I just think I've seen people say, let's stop the talk and let's do action. That's what the early church did. And I've been encouraged by that, and wanting to do more of that myself. Like, I don't want to get caught up in talk. I want to do loving things. And I've seen that.
Yeah, so I think in the difficult conversations and all of the, kind of unsettled dust, it's hard to find your way sometimes. And but I think the silver lining of it is that the Spirit uses that to bring together people that can advance the cause of Christ. And so we're encouraged to continue to see that. And so, I think Annlyn kind of touched on it, but just to say it a little more specifically, I think we need to talk face to face. Okay, so in terms of just if you want a resource, get off of social media and go talk to somebody. Because the social media, I think, it may not be the cause of polarization, but it fuels it. And so we've been encouraged we've gone into communities where we're like, oh, what are we getting into? Like, are we going to make it out? And then we got there and it's like, wow, these people are really cool. Like, they're really kind. And because, we related face to face. I think that's really important. Ellen also touched on it, but I've just seen that churches or individuals that really do have a clear identity in Christ and his kingdom, and clearly disassociate themselves with earthly kingdoms, are generally more equipped to navigate racial and cross-cultural challenges. And then those that align or identify with earthly political positions or agendas. And so in the Spirit, I believe the Spirit is continuing to bring those people together and doing that work in people's hearts. So I think we can be encouraged by that. In terms of like a book, we found that there's an author that a writer that I think he has a really, I don't know if I can put a stamp on all of everything he says, but we've just found him to be a voice that can speak for the Black community and for the church.
Can you repeat that? Because your audio cut out right as you said the name.
Sure. Yeah, Esau McCaulley.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, he wrote Reading While Black. Is that okay?
Right.
And there's a really great, he was interviewed by the Holy Post talking about believers and war and just political things. I can't remember the title of it, but if you type in Esau McCulley and the Holy Post, that was a very good interview that really summarizes a lot of what we're talking about.
Okay, good recommendation. Yeah, I enjoyed his book. I only read that one, but I thought it was really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's all that I have for you. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to chat with me. And yeah, anything else that you want to add?
No, we I guess one big thing that we always like to tell people when we do talks like this, we love to go to communities and we love to do the face-to-face. We don't really have very much of a social media presence. We're not opposed to it. I'd say kudos to the people who have the mental capacity to do that, but we enjoy face-to-face. So if anyone wants to email or chat or have us come visit, we enjoy those face-to-face interactions.
Okay, and I'll put resources in the show notes. Are you pretty easy to find? Your email and everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and I would just say that we have a lot to be grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
Starting to preach through Revelation, and there will be every tribe and nation and tongue will worship before the throne.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a great future ahead of us.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.